Hello there guys and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are going to be taking a look at Shocker. So I already have made guides for Kate Bishop, Cassie Lang and Future Ant-Man. That means we have Shocker, Will Vision and Baron Zemo left. Unlike the first three guides, the remaining three guides will likely be with rank 3 champions like my Shocker, and also keep in mind that my Shocker is at Sig 59 at the moment, which means he retains about 60% of power from his first special one. At 100%, at 200 Sig levels, he retains 100% of the power. So you do need another 140 Sig levels to get the last 40% or so. So that will be the first bit to talk about. Shocker is that he scales very well at the beginning and quite poorly at the end. Obviously, the higher Sig, the better, kind of, in a sense, because if depending on a fight, you might want your Shocker to be slightly lower Sig rather than Sig 200, and I'll explain that in a bit. But it's all kind of like dependent on the health pools that you are taking on. So we'll get to it in a bit. But as always, let's break down the positives, the upsides, the downsides of the champion before we actually get to the gameplay and the rotations and everything else. So the positives with the Shocker, obviously, as we all know, is that big heavy attack. So high burst damage, or in this case, high heavy attack damage. And that is undeniable, that he has a relatively high damage inflicted by one single hit of his heavy attack in relatively short fights, which can be very advantageous. Also, obviously, he has some immunities, so he's immune to shock and also concussion. I don't know how many other champions in game are immune to concussion, so that alone is something worth keeping an eye out for, especially with a lot of these super annoying nodes coming into the play where, you know, every 15 seconds you get a passive concussion on you and stuff like that. So that definitely can play a role in some content in the future, and is very, very good to note the fact that he is immune to concussion. Now, he's not immune to ability accuracy reduction per se, which, you know, I actually might prefer on tech champions, because that would help him fight against dominoes, which he can do, but he will still be taking the crit fail damage. So there are better tech options for that. But still, concussion immunity is quite interesting. Also, he reduces all incoming stun duration by 50%, and that kind of stacks with Limber, and he becomes almost stun immune to a point where you can pretty much ignore stuff like encroaching stun, or parries likely wouldn't do much to you either. Additionally to all that, he removes opponents' Limber Mastery. Now, that can be quite useful when you are fighting against, obviously, Alliance War and Battlegrounds opponents, because you will have this longer stun duration, unlike with most other champions, because at high tier wars, high tier Battlegrounds, virtually everybody runs Limber, and he basically disables that entire mastery. So it is quite cool. I do like that. And then on top of it, as many other tech champions, he has some prowess control, which is kind of integrated seamlessly in his kit, where you don't need to do anything special. You just hit your opponent based on how many charges you have. You have a chance to remove the prowess, which is quite awesome. And also the fact that unlike the first champions they showcased, he has relatively simple playstyle and rotation. There's nothing too crazy about him. Just, you know, throw a couple of level 1s and then go for level 2. His rotation is virtually identical to Penny Parker, except it's meant to be faster and also less finicky, because you do not need to look at the, you know, opponent's power bars. And then additional cool thing is that he does have that auto block safety net. Now, it will cost you some of your kinetic charges, but it can really save your bottom in some crazy hard scenarios when you would eat a massive special attack. So that's quite useful too. Now, negative is he has fairly mediocre long fight damage, realistically, because his damage is very cyclical. Basically, build up your charge, drop a massive heavy attack, and then you start from the get-go. There is no proper ramp-up that would remain. There is no kind of like higher damage state that you could sustain, really. You can kind of keep throwing your heavy attacks with lower charges to have like more linear damage, but it's not here nor there. Realistically, he peaks in his damage relatively early on, and then he returns to the very bottom. Also, the fact that he does rely on stuns. Now, the good thing is that his level 2 stun is passive. So if opponents like debuff immune, great, you can still get around that. Or if opponent shrugs off debuffs, like let's say Kingpin or something, you can still work around that because they can't shrug off the passive stun from level 2. The bad news is that obviously if opponent is stun immune flat out, like let's say, Hercules when he has some charges on, or if there is a stun immunity node, then you will have harder time dealing with those opponents. It is not absolutely impossible. You can still bait out heavy attacks and punish them. That will still, let you consume some of your charge and stuff like that, but your main party piece will be gone. Also, the thing that I do not like with him is RNG stuns and prowess removal. Now, with prowess removal, it's kind of better because you can ramp up to 100% chance if you do have enough kinetic charges or close to it. But with stuns, especially because it's not like a super long stun or anything, often it can work against you as well and can kind of disjoint the fight. For instance, when you're pushing your opponent to 2 bars of power and then you want to bait out a special attack from them immediately, and then you stun your opponent, and then you just kind of have to stand around there waiting for the stun to expire. So I have personally never, ever been a fan of random stands to stun, like Gwenpool or like Storm Pyramid X or what other champions we have. When it comes to stun effects, obviously they are extremely, extremely useful, but the fact that they can appear out of nowhere, they can also throw you off from your game and can't rely on them. And yeah, it always is just something that I find more of a nuisance. Kind of like when we used to have old unbuffed Spider-Man and some other champions who randomly will evade when you try to parry opponent, and then you end up taking more block damage or getting hit because of it. This is a similar situation where you're in your rhythm, you try to strike the opponent, and you just kind of get thrown off because of that stun. Additionally, he has extremely, extremely unremarkable base damage. Now, the fact that he does not crit in itself wouldn't be a deal breaker, right? But the kind of issue stands from he doesn't also substitute those crits with anything, really. Vast majority of the champions that do not crit has something else. It isn't necessarily better than the crit damage, but it is something extra. Like Guillotine 2099 places a degen whenever she would crit. Guardian shocks, Crossbones gains a fury, and so on and so forth. But this guy, he just has nothing, and therefore, with him not critting, with virtually all of his damage being in that heavy attack, it seems like you're hardly making any progress in the fight until you drop that heavy attack, and it's very kind of like lopsided fighting in itself. And yeah, I'm not a big fan of the fact that there's just nothing that would happen should you be critting with other champions. And also, realistically speaking, I think out of all of the newly added champions, he has the most limited versatility. Realistically speaking, he has obviously aforementioned points above: stun reduction, shock and concussion immunity, prowess control. But in general, he's just kind of like a flat beat stick of a champion largely. You're not going to be doing any kind of like sophisticated matchups or sophisticated job with him. He's quite clearly designed specifically for Battlegrounds and Alliance War length fights. And that at the same time doesn't mean that he does those things very well. Like, for instance, Hercules, is designed for everything but Battlegrounds fights, but he does the Battlegrounds fights well either way. And Shocker is clearly designed with Battlegrounds on, the forefront, but again, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's that great for Battlegrounds. And in general, yeah, obviously he has plenty of abilities. It's just overall, I do think he's fairly limited in his use compared to most other newer champions or many of the older ones as well. Now, some neutral things. all hits are physical, so that can be quite useful. Also, the fact that you can freely use him against like Human Torch and things like that, or if there's massive energy resistance, it doesn't matter for you. Highly dependent on opponent's rank and HP, and this has to do with his cyclical way of delivering damage to a point where, let's say, if opponent has, let's say, 200k health and you use rank 4 Shocker, you can do that fight in 50 seconds or 60 seconds. But if opponent has like 240k health, it might take you nearly double the time, or like it might take you extra minute or something, because all of his damage is very low until it explodes and then goes back down. So you always need to keep in mind and do mental calculations when using Shocker, whether 100 charges will reach the max kind of like health pool that you're trying to destroy, or you will need, a longer cycle, a shorter cycle, and so on and so forth. So in response to that, he's also very similar to kind of Corvus and Galen in a sense, where if opponent has a ton of HP, then it might not be worth using Shocker, for instance, or there are many different options you'd rather go with. Also, the fact that he relies on a single hit uh, is something that can be good and can be bad. As a good example would be, if you go up against an opponent that triggers regen, or there are some phases of opponent's health that you would want to skip. For instance, he would be perfect at countering something like Iron Man Infinity War, because the last 15%, that's where the trouble starts, when he starts auto blocking, gaining power, everything else. Because you dish out a huge amount of damage like at a moment's notice, means that you can completely bypass those phases. Kind of similar also with champions like either Toad or Sauron or somebody else like relatively, medium healthful Wolverine, where you don't really need to worry about the regeneration effects, or like again, uh, Infamous Item, and also a great example because his regen is very powerful, locks your special attacks in, and you can easily bypass it because you can have this massive burst to finish off the fight. At the same time, should something happen to your massive burst, should it be mitigated in any way, or there is some ability that prevents you from landing it, then you basically lose all of your damage ramp and you need to start all over again. So it can have its upsides, can have its downsides. Unblockable with penalty when used, and it's another one of those things that I personally don't enjoy really. I kind of wish, for instance, Juggernaut never had that ability where get 10 unstoppables, Juggernaut goes unblockable, but if you actually hit opponent's block with that unblockable, then you lose all of your unstoppables and all your damage. It's not quite as bad with Shocker, you don't lose all of it, but you do lose 20 of your ramp charges, which does set you back. So it can be helpful in some situations when you absolutely need to land a hit because of some timer, let's say Bane or something. But at the same time, it can also be something that, slows you down and you accidentally do. And it's just something to keep in mind. I personally am not a big fan of that. Here's this cool ability, but if you use it, but again, it can be helpful. It definitely has downside. Also, he does not interact much with damage modifiers to a point where, he's arguably one of the worst choices for anything and everything in like Act 7 and Act 8, because that entire content is built on, do the land and intercept, get 200% damage increase, and then you're going to be hitting very hard, or use a tech champion, you get, this many furies. He doesn't care about it at all. His heavy attack basically doesn't take it in consideration, and you will basically be doing as much damage as you are. And again, that can have good things, like he will be ignoring much of like stuff like weaknesses or some other attack modification. But it also obviously has its downsides depending on the nodes. Whether, if you would have some sort of damage increase, you will notice it significantly less on Shocker. And if you have some damage reduction, in most cases, you will notice it also significantly less, and he will perform relatively. It's kind of like with Galen. But let's move on to the gameplay. Whoops. Okay, so let's move on to the gameplay right here. So this is not the clip that I wanted to show yet. My phone's acting up a bit, but we should be fine. So his base rotations, it's very straightforward. Again, you will find yourself thinking of kind of like Penny Parker. Penny Parker is like a poster child for this, or Guardian, where you need to throw a level 1 or 2 level 1s and then go for max damage. And that's exactly what you guys are going to see here. So basically, you just hit the opponent as normal, start gaining your charges, activate your level 1, then throw in another level 1, then go for your level 2. That will be basically what you do all the time. And now I have 79 charges. 100 is the max unless you go for level 3, which, well, to be frank, if you have to go for level 3, I personally think Shocker is not the champion for that fight. That's not something, that I would find myself wanting to do with this champion. I'd want to pick a different champion then. Then you drop your level 2 and you start charging your heavy attack. The longer you charge it, the more damage you will do. And here we do 139, which is basically the max damage with the rank 3 Shocker without class advantage. His damage is affected by class relationships, but that's pretty much it. Like Liquid Courage Double Edge will not affect his heavy attack damage, well, by anything at all as other than his base damage. So it just doesn't matter if you boost him or if you put Liquid Courage Double Edge on, he doesn't really benefit from it. And then for the rest of the time, again, you just kind of rinse and repeat. Now, you can also just parry and heavy with Shocker whilst you have the charges. You don't need to go for one massive burst. You can, use 10, 20, 30 charges consistently. And it's approximately the same fight time, I think, or similar-ish. It is less hits, but the fight duration is kind of similar. I personally find it just easier to go for those big bursts. And so we had 128k here because we didn't quite have full ramp up. And that means we will need to go for like another level 1, level 2, and that will pretty much put the end to this. So at some point, I'm going to be throwing a random heavy attack as well, just because it doesn't really hurt, because as long as you use these charges, it's not like your damage disappears, you just kind of cash in on it quicker. And yeah, now go for level 2. Again, throw your hits. As we can see, all of the base damage is very, very, very bad. It's just when you land those big heavy attacks. All right, let's move on to the next clip. And this is against, obviously, the Deadpool with class advantage, a relatively smaller health pool. And this is going to be what Shocker is kind of intended to. Now, this is, quote-unquote, smaller Battlegrounds health pool. Keep in mind, this is also a rank 3 Shocker. And with Shocker, as I mentioned before, it's quite important to have as much attack. Therefore, he's one of those champions that has to be ranked to the level the opponents that you're fighting. Is like complete opposite of Aegon or something like that. If you want to use him against strong champions, you absolutely must have him at a very high rank. So you need to decide whether you like the champion, because at lower rank he will be significantly less impressive than at higher rank. And now again we're going for that, and this was enough to finish. So there's a solid win here, because I'm gonna be honest here. I tried this fight about 20 times to get the fastest time possible. Typically, I ended up doing this fight in about 55 seconds, a minute, either by doing one extra special one or then not, throwing my heavy attack and leaving my opponent at 1 HP. And it's one of those things with Shocker, where you need to know exactly how many charges you need against which champion for what rotation, and that is something that will take practice if you want to get the best results possible. Obviously, you can just go with your double level 1 full ramp rotation against everything, but that will put on still some extra 15-20 seconds to your fight typically, which is something that we are going to see here against this When of the Duck. Again, we have class disadvantage, which does affect Shocker's heavy attack damage, which is quite important. And obviously this guy has like 200k health. So obviously here it is going to go significantly slower. And that's yet one more of those things why I'm somewhat worried about his potential popularity in future, because his effectiveness really does depend on the health pool of the opponent compared to his rank. And against, lesser health pool opponents, he will be very, very good. Against higher health pool opponents, he's not going to be anything particularly remarkable. So here we can see I am struggling a bit baiting out that level 1, which, fine. I definitely, used the extra 10-15 seconds in this fight trying to bait out the special, which I didn't really have to. I could have just pushed the duck to level 2, but this is going to be Shocker with pretty much a full ramp up by the time I drop my heavy attack. Here I'm at 96 charges, so it's almost as ramped up as you can get. 96, I'm gonna drop 2 hits more, 98, so I'm 2 charges only short, so 98%. And I drop my hit, and we can see he still remains at 13%, and this is kind of like important. He still remains at 13%, and we are at 241 mark in this clip. And again, to get down those last hits, you need to use a special attack, then you need to, land a parry, then I'm going to throw a heavy, and now that's going to finish. And it creates quite a bit of extra time. So this is one of those situations where had Venom the Duck had slightly less health, or had my Shocker been rank 4, I would have saved myself another 10-15 seconds of that fight, but because I didn't quite finish it off, I needed to do all that stuff extra at the end. Still not a slow time by any means, but definitely not like a major, major nuke as well. Now, moving on. This fight, I'm not going to be trying to play it seriously. I'm just going to be trying to showcase Shocker's utility with the encroaching stun node, because he basically ignores it. I do have my Limber Mastery maxed, of course. You can see I'm just purposely trying to wait till that Limber expires. And you see that stun pop up, and it immediately disappears. And that stun does matter, because it will take you out of whatever you're doing. If you're throwing a combo, it will pause you for a second. Or if you're charging a heavy attack, it will basically cancel that charge and you will lose those charges. So you do not want to start charging when you're about to get stunned, for instance. But at the same time, you're pretty much safe. Because even if you are striking the opponent and you get stunned in the middle of that combo, you can still carry on striking the opponent. There will be like a weird little pause where the opponent's going to be slightly confused, but you will, in most cases, opponent's either going to dash back or you will manage to hit them first. And I didn't get hit once because I got stunned. Even if I got stunned in the middle of the special attack, I was still able to carry on evading the rest of the hits. So his ability to deal with stuns is definitely useful. So here we can see that I was able to carry on my combo and still connect my hits. And now I'm going to be trying to get stunned as, again, I strike my opponent, and I can just carry on with my combo. And I think in one of the next cycles... Okay, so here I just went for damage. In the next cycle here, I'm awaiting a special attack. I get stunned in the middle of it. I can still avoid that special attack. So whilst the stun isn't, he's not effectively immune to stuns, but the duration is so short that it hardly matters in most circumstances. So that is definitely super useful. Now moving on to some other fights here. We're going to be showing this. Obviously, Bishop and most mutants, he matches up against extremely well. You can see against Bishop, you're not even giving Bishop a single prowess, therefore his special 2 isn't dangerous. Even if Bishop was gaining prowess, you do have prowess removal in his kit, which is something that I'm going to showcase in a second. But here we can see that, we're not critting, we're not dealing any energy damage or anything else. He never gains any prowess, so you can always reliably, block the first hit, evade the latter parts of it. You can obviously also avoid bishops level 2, but it's just so much safer if that level 2 is not unblockable. And now I'm gonna bait out another level 2. We avoid this one fully and drop our level 2. Now we're gonna drop our heavy attack. So, but yeah, bishop's just one of the mutants. He matches perfectly well against pretty much all of the mutants, I would say. Yeah, that one heavy attack pretty much finished the fight. Now in this fight, I will actually not KO this fight, but I did want to point out that his massive burst has very solid advantages, like I discussed before. And in this fight as well, I wanted to show that he's quite good against Mystic champions in general, because he doesn't have inherent buffs other than the fact that you can gain dexterity. Now, obviously, that can still be a problem, because that will still feed Mystic Dispersion, stuff like that. But the fact that, there is no armor or buff that some Mystic champions could nullify, there is nothing else that he gains throughout the fight other than that dexterity, does in fact make him relatively suitable against the Mystics. The question is more about the health pool, like if you go up against Sasquatch, for instance, or something like that. How long will it take? Whether you will have the reach for that fight, more so than him not being a suitable kind of matchup for that. Oh wait, I think I screwed this fight up, and I'm gonna lose it on purpose. But the point is, I'm gonna rewind this. I also wanted to show the meaningfulness of that big amount of burst damage, because obviously champion like Absorbing Man, he has very, very powerful regeneration. So if I would be dealing steady amount of damage and getting Absorbing Man down to like 20%, as soon as he uses special attack, he would basically regen all the damage that I can dish out to him immediately. Whilst there are obviously better ways how to counter Absorbing Man, i.e. reversing his regen, the fact that you could deliver large amount of damage in one single hit means that, again, you can just kind of bypass the significance of Absorbing Man's regen. Now here, because I'm using a rank 3 4-star against a 6-star rank 4, I didn't quite have the reach, but the point kind of stands. We could get around that regeneration Absorbing Man has, because we are dealing damage in one massive burst. Now, here again, a decent showcase on how you can ramp him up quicker against champions that do gain prowess, or in the fights like aggression prowess, he will ramp up quicker. So every time opponent does gain a prowess, you gain 3 of your kinetic charges. So if you're going up against Toads and Saurons and other champions that gain prowess relatively quickly, or there are nodes that give opponents prowess, like aggression prowess, he will be ramping up quicker. Those are virtually also the only nodes that meaningfully affect the speed he's capable of finishing these fights. Because as I mentioned before, most of the attack modifiers don't really do much for him. But if you do have a fight where opponent gains a ton of prowess, his ramp up is significantly improved and becomes much, much, much faster, as we can see here. Right. Another thing to showcase, and we could actually see that, I believe, in the previous fight, but the fact that he has prowess removal. So, because we're not critting against Storm, she's not gaining many prowesses in the first place. But now we can see Storm using specials, gaining the prowesses, and you basically have 1% chance per each charge to remove a prowess. So at this point, let's say she uses level 2, there is some sort of massive lag spike, but you can easily remove those prowesses. So any matchup where you do see a prowess, he is gonna be very, very potent. He gets rid of them whilst also benefiting. Obviously, and the elephant in the room is the fact that Nimrod still would be better in virtually all of those instances, because he benefits from them and deals the extra damage all the way through. But Shocker is also quite cool at taking the fights where many prowess effects are involved. He can clean them up, and also he gains more damage because of them. And then the last clip that I have to show here for you guys is against Skull Twitch. And this is just the final bit, obviously, of the tech party trick to showcase the fact that he doesn't crit, which means that in a ton of fights, that alone is enough to bypass a lot of effects. Because yeah, you don't crit, no abilities will activate when you use him against Scarlet Witch. No abilities will activate when you use him against Mr. Sinister, for instance. He will not regen. There are plenty of nodes who also could punish you for critting, and because of it, yeah, you can kind of work around it. It does have its disadvantages as well, of course, when we're dealing with a ton of resistances and stuff like that. But it will have his upsides, so it is just something to keep in mind. Anyhow, that will be it for today's showcase. I hope you guys enjoyed it. On a personal note, I'm not sure how much I'll commit to Shocker. I'm not going to say that he's necessarily my type of champion, but at the same time, I do think there is a chance because he might be very good for Battlegrounds, but we will have to see that. I definitely still have my doubts about the guy, but at the same time, I very much so look forward to seeing how well he is going to do in the game. Let me know what you guys think. How do you guys predict what will happen to this guy? Meanwhile, that is it for now, and I'm going to catch you guys later. Bye. Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So we have all the information about